Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bellevue Club Swim Team podcast. We are super excited today to have USA swimming legend, three-time Olympian Gary Hall Jr. Gary, thanks for being on the show with us, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
How are you doing there in California?
Yeah, getting some sun in the backyard today.
Cool. Yeah, I want to start off the show here. Obviously, you come from a family of Olympians. How was it like growing up, and what did your childhood kind of look like?
It involved a lot of swimming. My parents were swimmers that met at a swim meet at a swimming pool that my grandfather built. Um, my maternal uncle was on an Olympic team with my father. He was on 3 Olympic teams. He was the only swimmer to carry the flag for the United States of America at the Olympic Games until Michael Phelps came along and joined him with that honor. And yeah, something like 10 world records. I remember as a kid going to his Hall of Fame induction ceremony in Fort Lauderdale. But yeah, I kind of grew up around a swimming pool, part of the swimming community. And honestly, I have to say, I think that was more beneficial than any genetic inheritance I could have received from parents. Was just the familiarity with the swimming environment and the water. And I was one of 6 kids. Anytime we went on vacation, it was to a swimming type of destination, the Florida Keys or the Bahamas. Everything was kind of swimming related. And so, yeah, I was just born into a swimming family.
It's great. Our team actually took a training trip down to Coronado, and we saw your father. And I remember Ash and I were totally fanboying when he walked on the pool deck. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it was kind of it's neat through the years. You know, even as a youngster, before I was a fast swimmer, I'd have people come up to me and say, "Gosh, I saw your dad in 1968 do a set in Garden Grove pool that just blew my mind," and it really, you know, like he just had this legendary work ethic and was liked by his peers too. And you know, so yeah, being able to hear stories like that, it's nice.
Yeah. Speaking about being well liked by his teammates, I know that, you know, we've talked to a couple of your former Olympic teammates as well, and they're super fond of you. So I'm excited to get into those stories later on this show. I'll let Ash and Dwight take over, but I know Dwight was going to ask about your late start to the sport.
Yeah, well, you talked about you'd been around the sport for, you know, the whole time, but didn't you really start really competitive swimming when you were a little bit older? Isn't that correct? Gary, can you hear me? When we left off, you talked about.
Do we actually have him? Gary, do you have us?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm back.
All right.
Yeah, you were talking about growing up around being surrounded by the sport, but you started competitive swimming pretty late, didn't you? How old were you when you started year-round?
Yeah, I didn't join a year-round swim club until a USS team until I was about 13, and right after 8th grade, going into high school, that I didn't start showing up to like a year-round swim program. I competed in a couple summer league things when I was younger, but I was playing other sports. I was really active in a wide variety of other sports. I didn't play contact football, and that's about the only sport that I didn't really participate in. I played flag football. So, you know, I just was doing track and field. I was doing basketball. I was, horsing around in the pool through all those years. Anytime, you know, growing up in Phoenix, it's 120 degrees in the summertime. So you're usually in these backyard pools, and, you know, there's always a thing. I'll race it from here to there. And so I always enjoyed doing that. And even, some funny story is when I was probably 12, I was a good swimmer just from, you know, swimming in backyard pools and doing those I'll race you from here to there types of things. and I was traveling in Europe with my family. And I had an aunt, and she was a real hustler. She'd go and meet with lap swimmers in the pool wherever we were, and she'd proposition them and set up a race. And she pulls me aside and she says, "Hey, you can make $5 for every race you win." And I'm like, "Great! I love swimming." And I found out later that $5 was nothing compared to what she was wagering on the side. So it was just, I loved it. Because these were like dedicated. Any, resort pool you go to, you can usually find a slow-moving master swimmer, or somebody, a mark, I guess,
A mark.
to her. Yeah. So that was my earliest introduction to big stakes racing, and I always loved it. So once I joined the swim team, and I didn't love at first, morning practices. I didn't love all the heavy training I was thrown in. There was no ramping up. It was I was not on the swim team, and then all of a sudden I was on a swim team that was doubles every day. I was doing 20,000 meters a day. That was with Pierre Lafontaine back in the late 80s and early 90s, and he was just a known just distance hammer guy. And he'd tell the team, if you can survive this, you'll be a great swimmer. But there were so many casualties, so many dropouts, so many overuse, overload injuries. I remember having to install a second industrial ice machine to treat the number of shoulder after every practice. There were just too many kids that one of those giant things that is outside of a 7-Eleven or Circle K wasn't producing enough ice for the team. That's crazy. Yeah. So quite a few years of that before I actually found a coach that had a better approach. I'll say that. And I still respect and love Pierre. He was definitely a tough guy mentality that had a lasting impact. But it wasn't until I started really getting kind of more specific type of training that I started to see improvements in the sport. And that wasn't until the end of high school.
Wow.
That's awesome. We're going to fast forward a little bit and then we'll come back to your training piece. But, fast forward, in 96, 2000, 2004, you brought the swagger, Gary. You brought the swagger to a sport that's somewhat conservative and
a little bit boring even.
Yeah, boring. Yeah, the sport was boring. And, you brought the swagger, you brought a lot of flair. Where did that come from? And, how did that all generate?
Well, the behind the blocks razzle dazzle type stuff started in high school. I mean, I was a very tall. I think I was like 6'1", 6'2" in high school, and just a beanpole. I was so skinny, and so it was a funny thing for me to be like kissing my biceps behind the blocks at high school. I was not. I already mentioned I was not the fast kid, so it wasn't like I was winning. I was consistently not winning. While doing these kind of shenanigans type of showmanship type stuff. And so I don't know. It just became fun, and those that were in on the joke appreciated it, and a lot of people watched that and were like, "What a jackass! What a real ass!" A lot of people hated it. Didn't seem fair. At the time, professional wrestling was like super popular, and that's all just show, no real. And so, I was looking at the attraction and how competitive it is between sports and how they market themselves. The NBA season is always trying to encroach a little bit into the NFL season, or Major League Baseball is trying to extend spring training programming. And so it's competitive, not just in the pool or on the playing field. Sport is competitive in terms of marketing and how they promote, and swimming, when you consider it compared to other Olympic sports, has done a great job of promoting itself. And thank you, Michael Phelps, for coming in at that. He helped a lot. But sport is entertainment, and I knew that all along. And not only did that I never thought of it as bringing attention to myself. It was just, that was me horsing around. And then people were like, oh, it's great at promoting the sport and, getting people wouldn't otherwise be watching a swim meet interested in, some characters. And there were a lot of other great swimmers that were doing it too. I wasn't the
Yeah, I mean, it was always so much fun to watch. I remember when trials was held in Long Beach, you rolled outdoors, the sun was shining, and everyone in the crowd loved it. Everyone ate it up. And I know for years you were able to provide that sense of swagger for USA Swimming. And it was really cool to kind of see that. Kind of going back to your unorthodox training and your alternative training. Dwight, you had a question on that, yeah?
Yeah, were you into visualization, or what kind of just alternative types of training did you do when you were competing?
Did we freeze again?
We can hear you.
Okay, wait. You're coming back into focus. Can you hear me?
We can
Yes.
hear you.
Okay. I'll keep trying. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear us?
Yes, I've been having trouble hearing Dwight. I think it might be a little spotty, but you want to ask again?
Yeah, I was just asking you about just alternative training that you did, maybe visualization, or just other aspects of training that you practice.
Okay. So, I mean, when my father was making Olympic teams back in the late 60s and early 70s, mid 70s, he had one guy that he trained with, and this is under Doc Councilman's team, one of the best teams in the world. There was one guy on the team that would go into the weight room, and it was because he was splitting his time between swimming and bodybuilding. And he was the only guy that my dad knew during those training years that was lifting weights. And so that changed. Now everybody, if you do a poll on Olympians, right, how many of them are lifting weights as part of their training? Every single one? Probably, yes. So there have been changes to the sport and to training specifically that have had massive impacts on the times. I mean, if you look at the times my father and his teammates were swimming back then, we've improved so much through the years, and that's because of better training. And so we've learned from previous generations what Matt Biondi and Tom Jagger were doing, and catching a lot of hell for doing it. This unorthodox, event-specific type of training, what was unorthodox at the time. I pulled from, I stood on the shoulder of those grades. And I think that each generation of swimmer does that. It's the natural progression. And so the training that I was really proud to help advance was race specific type of training. I remember doing those 20,000. I remember over Christmas training camp one year, we did between 25 and 31,000 meters a day, long course at altitude in northern Arizona, and just being hammered, and I remember having the conversation my sophomore year in high school, not the most articulate age, right, where you're able to piece reasoning together. But I remember having a very detailed conversation with the coach saying, in track and field, you've got the sprinters and they train this way very specifically. And you've got the cross country guys over in this other category. It's almost like a completely different sport. Look at the build of the two. And you've got shot putters that do something different. But in swimming, it doesn't matter if you're in the 400 IM or the mile or the 50 freestyle or the 200 backstroke, everybody does the same set. And so I remember questioning that early on, and I think questioning really does help. There are a lot of coaches out there who will take that as a personal questioning of their authority, of their knowledge base and stuff like that. If a kid is asking questions, you want the kids to be asking questions. You want the kids to be thinking through, why am I doing this? How is this making us better? And that thought process led to so many innovations in the way that we were training, the way that I will claim that, you know, I was definitely one of the first people to incorporate core strength. I started training with a boxing guy, and was introducing us to the stuff that Phelps and Lochte definitely had incorporated into their training programs in years following. You know, and now Michael Andrew has a name for it. Back then we didn't have a name for it, but it was the exact same thing. I mean, just high intensity repetition, race specific type of training.
Let's talk about that evolution a little bit for you, from kind of an age group swimmer who's grinding it out with everybody else. I believe you grew up swimming with Cleet Keller.
Yeah.
So two Olympians in two very different events. How did that kind of transform through your college years? And I remember as a young coach going to a talk with that Mike Bottom gave, and it was basically about you and your training in probably early 2000s. And all I remember was, I'm never going to coach 5 guys who are all 6'5" and Olympians, but what these guys are doing is really cool. How did that sort of 5-6 year arc go from Gary's this age grouper who's kind of looking around going, or this club swimmer kind of going around, looking around going, this isn't what I should be doing if I'm going to be a sprinter, to hooking up with Mike Bottom and getting that? I believe you guys were doing mental training and brainwave measuring and all kinds of stuff that nobody else was doing at the time.
So, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Shooting in and out. I don't know if you can hear me. I will. You know, I didn't get the freedom.
All right.
Okay, so should I just jump in?
Yeah, we'll be able to edit it no matter what, so don't worry about any of that.
Yeah. So the question was, you know, I'm looking around saying, hey, why are we doing all this stuff, questioning things, and how did I kind of make the transition to be able to do that?
Yeah, and how did, I mean, I'm sure there were coaches along the way that weren't super interested in your ideas on you needing to go shorter.
Yeah. So there was a brief couple-year transition where Eric Hansen, who was a coach, he was a sprinter, and he competed against Biondi and Jagger in some races. And he had a little bit more insight as to how to train a sprinter than Pierre did. And so that was my first, I guess, scaling back, but it was still, I mean, massive yardage and not what I needed. And Eric was difficult for a lot of reasons. And so I ended up going, it wasn't until the summer after my junior year in high school that I swam fast enough that I even considered swimming in college as a possibility. My time was fast enough. I had a big breakthrough meet at junior nationals and was a top recruit all of a sudden in the country. Obviously people knew about my father. So, you know, there was interest from coaches. I ended up going to the University of Texas. Eddie Reese is one of the greatest guys I know out there. A lot of people that know him think the world of him. I do as well, count me in. But I told Eddie after 3 months that I had made the wrong decision, that the program wasn't right for me. And that was really hard because I loved Eddie. You know, he really kind of took me under his wing and then mentored mentor me and develop me into a top level swimmer. But I just, again, it went back to the philosophy that I had to be true to, was that I was just doing a lot of yardage, too much yardage. And I had an okay season there. Didn't swim great at NCAAs. I think I made the finals, but could have done more. And came back to Phoenix, and that was the summer that I qualified for the World Championships after my freshman year in college, and then it was right after that, the '94 World Championships, that I connected with Mike Bottom, and that changed everything. I was about to quit. Swimming for Eric Hansen, I was about to quit. I was miserable. He was having me do these training that I didn't believe in. I didn't believe in him. He didn't believe in me. There was a lot of fighting. And I remember going to the World Cup series and having an Australian coach who I won't name, but I'd never met this guy before, and he cornered me, and he was putting his finger in my chest about what a fucking asshole I was for not swimming fast. And that was really, really hard. I was not a happy swimmer, and I was ready to walk away from the sport before I met with Mike. And it took him about 3 months to take me from the edge of quitting to being winning the Pan Pacific Championships in '95. And I won 4 gold medals there in the 50, the 100, and was one of the top seeds going into the '96 Olympics. And I stuck with Mike every season for the rest of my career.
You say it took you about 3 months. How, and you were obviously searching for something that was alternative and different, but how did he kind of help foster that trust right away in a manner in which you were like, this is my guy, this is it?
Yeah. Well, something that differentiates Mike Bottom from other coaches is that he graduated top of his class in psychology. He is a brilliant psychologist, and he knew intuitively that there isn't a one-size-fits-all motivation, right? That different personalities, different motivators, what motivates us and what demotivates us varies from individual to individual. And so that in itself, that realization, definitely fell in line with one-size-fits-all training doesn't fit everybody. One-size-fits-all mental preparations type stuff doesn't. And there were some guys, world-class swimmers, some of the best in the world, that needed, a hug and a little encouragement, and other guys, he needed to get in their face, 2 inches nose to nose, and scream at them. And that's what worked for those individuals. And he knew who needed what. And so if he had gotten in my face and screamed at me like the Australian coach that had cornered me at the World Cup meet, it would have never worked. It just wouldn't have worked. And so for the first coach in my entire career that I come across, he had the ability to fine tune and adjust his approach and his methodology to individuals. And so he was able to do that because it was a smaller group. We would keep a group of 10 to 15 athletes as a core group. And he was able to work more individually. And so it wasn't until I had success in the sport and reached the highest level of sport and came across Mike Bottom that I really started having the freedom to experiment. I mean, I remember thinking creatively, we'd be doing starts and we were doing just try anything, and you just something crazy. I don't know, who cares if it fails? We got the timing system set up and let's experiment. So I love that creativity because it's just the opposite of these 20,000 meters, a day type of back and forth, chase the black line type of thing. And I've always had an attention deficit disorder type of approach, and so it was really, really difficult. I wouldn't have been able to continue on in the sport if it had just been the back and forth. But infusing with that creativity, I really, that was something I responded well to.
How did you meet him? How'd you come across?
Yeah, this is kind of a cool story. So in 1976, my father won a bronze medal in the 100 butterfly in the Montreal Olympics, and Joe Bottom, Mike's older brother, beat my dad, got the silver medal. And it was, he won. He either placed first or second. Joe, Mike's older brother, and the Bottom boys were out of Santa Clara. There were 3 of them. And Mike was the youngest, and Mike was this great swimmer that my dad always knew as the younger brother. He was teammates on the Olympic team with Joe, so he knew Joe, and he knew Mike as the younger brother. And then Mike obviously went on to have an incredible swimming career himself. He qualified for the 80 Olympics, the one we boycotted. As I mentioned, he went into psychology. He's really a brilliant mind, and probably was intending to go in that direction professionally. And maybe because of the boycott, because he was never able to fulfill that dream that he realized. He did qualify for the games. I think that he probably took that psychology degree and applied it to the sport of swimming in a way that, I'm not downplaying the importance of mental health and psychology, right? Like you go into therapy, and how do you measure results? How do you measure success? Okay, and if you have somebody that's depressed, are they less depressed? It's a spectrum type of improvement, incremental improvement. But he was taking a psychology degree and applying it to something that could be measured to the 100th of a second. So especially in identifying what motivators and demotivators, no psychologist in the world had ever had this kind of test set up, like, to find out what works and what doesn't work with immediate results. And so it was really, really neat to be part of that experiment and to contribute to it in some ways. And I can't give Mike enough credit for and obviously he's the head coach for both men's and women's and the diving team up in Michigan now. He's the guy up there. They won the NCAA title. Mike was able to realize that dream of going to the Olympic Games through his swimmers and being able to share in those victories with so many of them. I mean, he's produced so many great Olympic swimmers. So it's a really neat story about how the overlap dates back generationally to my Bottom.
Cool. So here you are, kind of a bit of a meteoric rise from 14, 15, 16-year-old. You set the world on fire, if you will, at the 95 Pan Pac Championships, and you head into Atlanta, and there you meet the great Alexander Popov.
Yeah.
So let's kind of start talking about the 3 games you went to and what it was like to be standing next to that guy. And I believe, were Tom Jager and Matt Biondi still hanging on at that point?
Biondi had retired, and Tom Jager competed in the 96 trials.
Okay.
And he was a friend of mine by that point. And we'd spent quite a bit of time hanging out socially. So I'd gotten a great influence on me in so many different ways, not just in training and sport, but just kind of showing me the ropes of how USA Swimming operated at the time, some of the and he faced a lot of challenges that I faced similarly, and the reputation of sprinters alone at the time, kind of everybody thought that we were lazy because we weren't doing 20,000 meters a day. Yeah, he was a great influence. And then Popov, I'll talk, that's a legitimate rivalry. I hated that guy and he hated there's no way to sugarcoat that. I did not like him at all. And the rivalry started, it was immediate. I qualified for my first national team, first international meet. That was the World Championships in Rome in 1994. And I walked into the ready room before my first race there. And I was there, and Popov walked in and walked straight up to me. And this is the reigning world record holder and Olympic champion. And he walks up, does not pause, doesn't look around. He walks straight up to me and said some really, really terrible things. And I was really confused because this is a guy that I admired, and he viewed me as a threat right away, and that's how he was going to deal with it, and play some head games, and he definitely did that right away, in the ready room before our race in '94. So that was, a learning curve for me. Like, oh, okay, this is the way it is. He was just ruthless in trying to get an advantage, even just a slight one. And if he could get inside, and I have to say, it worked. I was walking out to the block saying, is sort of like an English speaking thing? Like he just doesn't speak English? Or is he really an asshole? And turns out he was an asshole. But a lot of people said that he was a nice guy. I know a lot of people that trained with him down in Australia that said that he was a really, really nice guy. I never knew that side of him.
Because he was trying to do anything he can to beat you.
I knew the game face, Alex Popov, and he was a great competitor, ruthless in that way. But those people that trained with him in Australia, a couple of them, were younger swimmers that started to get good, and his attitude toward them changed overnight the second he viewed them differently, that they had the possibility of beating him. So I think that he was king of the mountain, and he wanted to guard that. So that went on for he won in '96. 7/100ths of a second separated the gold from the silver in one of those races, and I just was like any of those races that you lose by just a little bit, it stings, it sticks with you. You dream about it at night. It pushes you a little bit to work a little bit harder. It was definitely one of those experiences. I definitely wasn't disappointed with the performance in '96. It was the best time. I felt like I had, in a pressure situation, stepped up. My best performances of those games were in the relays by a lot. Russia was a body length ahead of us in the 4x100 freestyle relay in the '96 Olympics as I dove in for the anchor leg, and was able to. I felt like I had good performances in '96, nothing to be disappointed with, but I wanted to turn that silver medal into a gold medal. And so he stuck around, and he was, and then I beat him in 2000 and 2004. So
when
you win some, you lose some.
In '96, you're what, 20?
21.
21 at the games. And I think probably the money that's in the sport is not there now. How, in your mind, were you going to continue to train, continue to be able to stay in it without the structure that we currently have now of professionalism, and how much did that second place finish serve as your motivation for those next 4 years?
It's 2 weeks after the '96 Olympics were over. I got on a plane, flew by myself to Australia, to Sydney, to look at the pool.
Oh, wow.
I had intentions to make it to 2000. And for the 2000 trials, I had to sell my car. It was a 1970 Chevy Nova to get the plane ticket and pay for the hotel room to the 2000 trials. That's all in. I made $1,200 a month. That was the most I ever made as a professional swimmer. And I had a positive marijuana test in '98. And after that, I was untouchable. I went 10 out of the 16 years I swam professionally without any sponsor or any support. I'd say it was a different time. I really was very vocal through that time about how swimmers needed an athletes association to organize and, fight for some representation. FINA had an athlete representative. It was a jester role that they, didn't have any influence at all at the time. And people like Janet Evans and Matt Biondi And they were really influential and 100% influential. Tom Jagger, Matt Biondi, Janet Evans, those were the ones that got the $1,200 a month. So when they were starting out, that didn't even exist. And hardly the lap of luxury. I mean, those are $5 sandwiches for lunch and pizza and sleeping on the couch, breakfast cereal.
Not exactly the optimal training. Sleep and food and all the things that.
You sold on that though, right? Like this is sacrifice, right? Mm-hmm. Like you do this for your country, and that's a big enough honor. That's a big enough reward. You get to represent the United States of America. So, I don't think that the people that are making those sacrifices, the athletes, even today, in some ways, they don't know the extent of what those sacrifices are until they retire and try to transition into something else. I retired from the sport after the 2008 trials. The economy was on burning. And it didn't matter how successful I was as a swimmer. I had a resume that said swimmer.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
I was 34 years old, and there were hundreds of thousands of layoffs across the country. Similar situation as it is now. Unemployment was like going through the roof, and so it's tough. It's tough and I think, thank God, we're talking about it more in terms of mental health. The transition and this depression, right, and the loss of identity, and how we redefine ourselves going forward in this lack of services for Olympics athletes and athletes that have represented it and has done the same thing. In some ways, it's a huge disadvantage because this is downplaying maybe tremendously, but you're a machinist, an assembly line worker that is used to doing a lever pull, to make a widget on a conveyor belt. Mm-hmm. And swimming is this guy, and you do the same motion over and over and over and over. You do it for 20 years, and then you say, okay, it's time to do something else, and all of a sudden they're like, wait, not this, not the widget pull. What do I do? Yeah. And a lot of people struggle with that.
I just read an article about collegiate swimmers when they retire, and how you're all of a sudden out of the sport and all your structure and how you've sort of defined yourself, and now you've got a degree and you've got to go out into the world and figure out how to do that without this thing that you had over here that kept you centered and focused, and that have been exponentially harder for you, going from a 3-time Olympian, barely missing in 2008. You finished 4th as a 34-year-old. We can't all be Anthony Ervin. And then having to go out into real life.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, and this is definitely a lemonade story, right? When life deals you lemons. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes before the 2000 Olympics. And that put me in an arena where I was doing diabetes research, fundraising, and diabetes advocacy work. And that teed up a career that made that transition so much easier for me personally. A lot of athletes don't have that. And then I mentioned that I did not receive any type of funding for 10 out of the 15 years that I was on the national team. It was through the diabetes work that I was only able to sustain myself and pay for the training that was necessary to continue to compete in the sport.
So let's kind of rewind back to 1999 when you were diagnosed. So you're coming off Atlanta. You're pretty focused on Sydney. How did that affect your lead up to trials and the games? As the parent of a daughter who got diagnosed with type 1 when she was 7, we appreciate your work in the community. You're always one of the ones that I point out to her.
Thank you for that. So yeah, it came out of nowhere. There was no family history, and I was training, and I started getting real shaky hands in practice. Like I'd touch the wall and my hands were shaking. And I found that if I would go and get some Gatorade, it would stop, and all of a sudden, like take a deep breath and like would feel normal again. So that was the first thing that I was noticing. And then I was starting to notice that I was thirsty a lot, drinking tons of fluids, peeing a lot as a result of that. All classic symptoms of diabetes. My vision got blurry. I was dating this girl at the time that I ended up marrying, and she was like, my friend is having a party and you're going. And I'm like, I've been in bed for 3 days. I've lost 20 pounds. There's something wrong with me. I feel like terrible. And she forced me to go, and I went to that party and I collapsed. And this was a year and a half out from the Sydney Olympics. And I was diagnosed and told by 2 doctors that it was the end of my swimming career. Not possible to compete at the world stage any longer. Exercise is going to be good in moderation, but this has never been done before, and it's not possible. And in their defense, I think that probably when they were trained in medical school, it wasn't possible. The insulins that they had at the time and ways to manage the disease, that would have been a really maybe impossible task. So, but I was fortunately, diagnosed in an era where there were advances being made in how we can control the disease. And if you can control the disease, then you can continue doing what you were doing before you were diagnosed. I was told that by a more encouraging doctor that I eventually came across, Dr. Ann Peters at the USC Keck School of Medicine. She was amazing, so influential in my ability to get back into the water after kind of getting a grasp on how to manage this very serious disease. So I can't thank her enough. Ann Peters, she was great. But in the process, was able to, in quick time, really accelerate this learning curve through her and the resources that she was providing. And she wasn't sure either. Like, this sounds like an interesting, challenge. Let's see what we can do. And I liked that. That was all I needed after being told it's impossible, by 2 doctors. Like, hey,
needed that little bit of a crack, right?
Let's try it. That seemed really encouraging, and I liked that type of attitude. So I got back in, and nobody knew that it was possible. I had placed second in the 50 and the 100 in the previous Olympics. I wasn't even listed in the trials brochure as someone contender, the way that they will sometimes profile people. And I don't think anybody expected me to be there. I know teammates, other swimmers that had heard the news of my diagnosis, they immediately had written me off. They told me years later, like, okay, he's out of the way. But so I surprised a lot of people, a lot of doctors, a lot of the sports medicine community, and obviously the endocrinology societies and diabetes groups. And being able to do that, right? So all this, if you're a diabetes nurse educator and you're giving out bad news all day long, I'm sorry, your child has just been diagnosed, or you've just been diagnosed with terrible disease, and you got to change everything, and you got to do all this, and then the risk of complications and everything. You've been through it. So.
It's a pretty harrowing weekend. They lock you in Children's Hospital, and you spend 48 hours just getting inundated with all this information. About how your life is going to change and how your kid's life's going to change.
So before going into trials, before going into meeting with Ann Peters, I after having this kind of horrible diagnosis experience, I had a goal of making the diagnosis less scary for kids and their families. It wasn't to get back to the Olympics and beat Alex Popov. I mean, that went back shelf. I mean, that was shelved as any consideration. And it was a challenge. It was like learning how to swim all over again. I mean, the first day that I was trying to, swim, dealing with low blood sugars in the pool and stuff like that. I mean, there were a lot of times where I did not think it was possible, but kept plugging away at it. And it ended up working out. I ended up swimming faster than I ever had before and qualifying for the 2000 Olympic Games and making that diagnosis a little bit less scary so that, these overworked diabetes nurse educators can sit down with a kid that's been newly diagnosed and say, there's guys that are competing in the Olympic Games and winning gold medals with type 1 diabetes. If you work hard and you manage this disease, anything is possible. So that is something that I've remained really proud of, and it's definitely been in line with the type of advocacy work that I've continued to do through the years.
And those of us out there on the front lines really appreciate that.
Thanks.
Talk a little bit about your experience in Sydney, your relationship with Anthony, what it was like to tie for the gold medal, and maybe a little bit of the rivalry with the Australians at the time, and how that sort of grew from 2000 to 2004. And we can talk about relays in 2004 down the line here in a second.
Yeah, so gosh, Anthony was he's being recruited out of high school to Berkeley by Mike Bottom. So I had heard about this really talented swimmer, and knew of this kind of, and I think Mike, Anthony was struggling with a lot of the things in the sport and the traditional way of doing things that I had been through. And so I think that Mike could see that, I could influence Anthony and maybe kind of help be part of, not be responsible for it. It's not possible to corral Anthony Irvin, but, that I had enough rebellious spirit in me that it was something that Anthony could relate to. And we were a bit of a band of misfits. Anthony and I, part of that group. We were, under Mike. 2000, it was the World Sprint Team. Before we changed that name to the Race Club, but it was basically, we saw ourselves as a group of 10 to 12, like swimming assassins, and we were, from all over the world. We had Bart Kizarowski from Poland, and swimmers from everywhere. So we were one of the first groups to really have an international training team, and that was all done under the belief that all ships rise with the tide, and Anthony was part of that. So it was neat to see him develop from that high school, very rebellious high school swimmer who's toying with the idea of whether he wanted to be in the sport or not. Didn't identify with a lot of the people that he had been hanging out with in the sport up to that point. And so I think Berkeley was a perfect environment for him, that he was able to develop not just his swimming, but his appreciation for things outside of the sport. And it's always been really important to him, as it's always been really important to me, to maintain a life outside of the sport of swimming. And so to be able to tie him in Sydney, that's a dream come true. I mean, he was a friend, he was a teammate. We were very competitive, and had faced off quite a few times. It's and again, that's where the psychology of Mike Bottom really came into play. Is how do we take,
I was just about to ask this,
guys that are all competing in the same event, that all have a shot. These are guys that you're trying to help, but also beat at the end of the season. And so how he was able to push that kind of aggressive, competitive nature in us and get the most out of it without it flaring up to the point that we're in a fist fight. There were, I think, a couple times where it was pretty close. So you put all that aside at the end of the season, and if you could write a book, perfect ending, that was it. I mean, being able to tie him, I never felt like I would have preferred to have won it alone. And I had the opportunity to do that, 4 years later in Athens, standing on top of the podium by myself. But I really enjoyed tying Anthony and sharing that experience with him. It's something that ties us together forever.
Yeah, and keeps you, as long as he's still swimming, keeps you connected, huh?
Yeah, I'm a blurb now in the just a side note in his progression. I was screaming at the top of my lungs when he won in Rio. I just for him. I was there in London too, watching him play fifth, and You know, it's been neat to track his progress, because even through those wild years that everybody has heard about, you know, where he kind of went off the deep end, you know, we would still stay in touch through that time. And so to see, you know, that boomerang effect where, you know, he did come back to the sport and you know, did things that nobody thought was possible. Again, it's
Yeah.
kinda neat.
Speaking of age and nobody thought was possible. So 2004, you're the oldest man on the team,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
So trials, you make it in the 50. Were you top 6 in the 100?
Yeah. For 2004, I did. I qualified for the relay.
Okay. So we did our research. We talked to a couple members of the 2004 team, and Carolyn Joyce was a young 18-year-old on that team, had just made her first Olympics. Recalls walking into a training session at Stanford where they're all about to go up in yardage, and there's Gary, you can true or false this, floating in the dive tank on an inner tube, head back, and that was your practice for the day, while everybody else went $8,000 long course.
Yeah, that
She
is true.
tells the story. Yeah, that is true.
Recover. You know, you know, they thought I wasn't doing anything, and I actually was. So I went out and I bought one of those inflatable rafts, and it was like a long floaty device, and I'm laying on that floating device, and my hands were below the surface of the water, and I was just like sculling. So I was actually doing some sculling drills, because you could lay on your stomach and kind of put your arms out in front, and it looks like you're just asleep, right? Because your head's down, you're on a floaty device in the diving well, and you're the only one, and everybody else is swimming yards. But if there was a way, it actually doesn't make sense. Like, I'm going to defend this now. It sounds ridiculous, but my elbows were extended like over the front of the floating device, so it would keep your elbows high. And then your water, in order to scull, you had to drop your hands down into it and scull kind of like this. So it didn't look like I was doing anything, but I was actually, I did that for 2 hours or something like that. And maybe
Kept your feel for the water coming off taper, right?
and then at some point I did fall asleep, and I actually just laying there.
In the California sun.
I'm training camp.
So 2004 games, you're there primarily to swim the 50. And they left you off the relay.
Yeah, that was hard. That was hard. I didn't like that. There's politics in the sport of swimming, and there were politics.
So, you know, like any other swim meet, you're there forever. That one in particular, the games, it's an 8-day swim meet, a 7-day swim meet. And you have to kind of compartmentalize all that in the 50s all the way at the end of the week. Yeah. How kind of at that point in your career, how do you handle that? And how do you keep yourself focused on what you're there for and kind of processing that disappointment?
Yeah, so outline some of the disappointment. So Michael Phelps was in 2004, positioned to maybe win 7 medals. By Mark Spitz for the most Olympic medals in the games. He was able to win 8.
And Matt Biondi.
4 years later. But Speedo wanted him to win 7 medals. The United States wanted him to win 7 medals. It was the story. It was kind of the media story, and obviously. So we knew after trials that even though Phelps didn't swim the 100 freestyle at trials, that he was going to be on the relay for the finals. And so somebody, one of the 6 of us that did swim the 100 and qualified for it, was going to be removed. And I didn't think that was fair. And I spoke up about it before it was me. Maybe it wouldn't have been me if I hadn't spoken up about it. But I remember after the morning swim, Eddie Reese came over to me and told me that I wasn't going to be on for the finals that evening. and that Phelps was going to swim, you know, it was hard because he hadn't done one relay exchange with the team through the entire duration of the training camp, and I pulled Michael aside at one point. It was in an elevator, and I said, "Listen, nobody's trying to rain on your parade here, but this is a big deal. People have worked their entire lives to earn this relay spot. I don't want you to take it personally for me defending whatever that swim. This is before we knew that I was the one that was removed. I said, I don't want you to take it personally that I'm defending the right for one of these swimmers to compete on that relay that swam in the trials and in that spot." And he didn't say much. He just left. And so it was particularly painful for me because I was part of the 4x100 freestyle relay in Sydney that lost that event for the first time. I mentioned to you that I took Team USA in 4x1 in Atlanta in '96 from third to first.
Well, you were Jason Lezak before Jason Lezak was Jason Lezak.
No. There's only one. And that was the greatest relay swim, hands down. Nobody can argue that. But I was part of that very disappointing relay in Sydney, and it wasn't a disappointing performance on our part, but we lost, and that stung. And I wanted redemption. I wanted at least the chance at redemption, and I had earned that. I had qualified in that for that position. So, it was it hurt, and it took a lot of resilience to be able to take that, and that's a tough pill to swallow. And I was trying to handle it as maturely as possible, and I felt that it was best to just go off on my own and do that, whatever it would take. I did not want that experience to derail my chances in the individual event that I had qualified for. They couldn't remove me from that. So I went off to the islands. I didn't go to the finals, and I just had to get my head together. I was furious. I was just crestfallen.
You left Athens for a couple days,
but than furious. But we all that was the hardest. That was the hardest challenge in my swimming career. Was dealing with that disappointment.
And you bounced back, and you showed resiliency, and you won the gold, man. So damn.
Well, it kind of worked out, and I got a bronze medal thanks to Michael Phelps and his and the team in the relay for swimming in the morning. And things work out. And obviously, that experience, I'd like to think maybe helped tee up or better position Phelps to win 8 4 years later. Maybe, just having the ability to kind of run through the program with that many events. I was always a fan of Michael Phelps. He was 15 on the 2000 team. I was able to be on teams with his older sisters, national team trips and stuff like that. So I was able to watch him come up in the sport, and been a big fan. But so again, it wasn't anything personal. It wasn't his decision. I couldn't fault him. It wasn't mad at Phelps. But there was a lot of pressure on the coaches to happen. So
as someone who changed the face of the sport, of our sport, and I'm not sure how engaged you are nowadays, but where do you see the future of our sport heading for both women and men?
Well, gosh, all eyes on ISL right now, right? Like how's this? I would have given up my Speedo to have an ISL opportunity when I was. And so I'm really interested to see, what the lasting impact is going to be in terms of professionalism in the sport and the opportunities for young swimmers. It's tremendous. So I think that, if we're looking at the future of the sport, this is something that pray for at these rinky-dink swim meets that I used to attend. We used to sit around in the hotel rooms, talk about how we could make the sport, how we could build a pool in an arena. Crazy ideas. And you bring swimming to the people instead of trying to bring people to the swimming. It was just discussed so passionately for so many years through my career. To see that happening now is really neat. I wish them continued success.
Who are you currently a fan of? I know that you love the sport, and you obviously, with USA Swimming, but there's some good up and comers. Who do you think we should keep an eye on from Gary Hall Jr.'s perspective?
Yeah, he's already risen to the top. Yeah, Caleb. I mean, that guy's phenomenal, right? I don't know him at all, haven't met him, but I have enjoyed watching what he's done in the sport, and he seems like a good guy from where I'm sitting. So I think really pleased to see USA Swimming, because there was always talk through Phelps' career is like, what's going to happen when he retires? How are they going to continue to? How are they going to replace a guy like that? And this guy Caleb Dressel is phenomenal.
No, he's doing some crazy things. Yeah. With this crazy time right now, Gary, obviously we're all stuck at home. We're all, dealing with a lot of different things, both mentally, physically, emotionally. For our viewers and our listeners out there, what are some words of encouragement you can provide for everyone as the great Gary Hall Jr.?
I'm laughing at the great Gary Hall Jr. part. Not used to it. Thank you. It's going straight to my head. I'm feeling really good about myself now. Thank you. I would encourage everybody to keep in mind that all your competitors, if they're in Russia or if they're in Brazil or Australia, are under the same environment, or from the rival high school. They're all in lockdown. They all have limited access, if any access, to a swimming pool. So even though this is hugely interrupting to our day-to-day lives and our training, we're all in this together. So in some ways, this is a level playing field. So keep that in mind. And all you have to do, I remember I had this philosophy. I had developed this philosophy very early in my swim career. So you can consistently outperform the person in the lane next to you. Eventually, you'll be the best, right? So everybody else is in a similar situation, lockdown. How do you do a better job of handling this than the person in the apartment next to you? So get creative, bounce off the walls and try to keep things, those dryland activities as swimming or stroke specific as possible. But this is an opportunity. I mean, you can look at it as an opportunity to really make some gains over people. There are people that were, positioned really, really well and just aren't handling this psychologically or the training part of it well. Maybe they're packing on weight or something. There were people that had a shot at these Olympic Games that in a year from now, because they didn't respond to this crisis better than the other people in the lane next to them. I'm saying the lane next to them, but they'll ruin their chances. Other people will make those get a step or two on them. And so it's up to you. It's up to you how you're doing in what you're doing in your home to deal with the situation and outperform. Again, it's just outperforming the person next to you, right? That's the way I would look at it. This is a new reality for all of us. We're taking it in, trying to make some sense of it all, and just taking one day at a time. That's all we can do. Some things are out of our control in this situation, and this is life. We haven't come across anything like this before, but those that a champion isn't determined by their victory. As a champion is determined by how they deal with adversity and obstacles, overcome obstacles. And that's the people that deal with this situation best are it's going to be on the team in Tokyo next year.
Gary, thank you so much for that. thank you for
Thanks a lot, Gary.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time today to speak with us.
Sure.
Stay safe, stay healthy, man.
Yeah, sorry about the glitches there at the program.
No worries.
Keep up the good work you're doing. I miss it up there in Seattle from time to time. Not the winter time, but
No.